Slavery. So let's start with what slavery is defined as. Slavery is the activity of legally owning other people who are forced to work for or obey you, or the condition of being legally owned by someone else and forced to work for or obey them. So slavery was legal. It was 100% legal to own another human being, for that human being to have minimal to no rights, and for them to be recognised in the eyes of the law as someone else's property. Slavery was one of, if not the first form of human trafficking. Slaves were not free to move around freely. They could not just go to town, for example. Choices were made for them, and these choices ranged from what job they did to what happened to their own body. It's worth noting, slavery did not start with the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery as a concept, like colonialism, has been practiced since ancient civilizations. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Incas, the Mayans, they all practiced slavery. Slavery even existed in Africa and within indigenous populations around the world, with many of the quote-unquote upper classes within a particular society having servants, maids and cooks. So between the 16th and 19th centuries, estimated the transatlantic slave trade transported somewhere between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. During the 15th century, Portuguese ships were already trading slaves and bringing enslaved Africans to work on plantations on the Portuguese-owned islands of Cabo Verde and Madeira, both located in the East Atlantic. By the 1700s, English and French merchants dominated around half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from West Africa, places like Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon. The transatlantic slave trade was an example of triangular trade. If you look to the diagram just to the right, you can roughly see why. Textiles, alcohol, and manufactured goods would go from Europe to Africa. Then enslaved Africans would go from Africa to the Americas, and finally sugar, tobacco and cotton grown in the Americas would then go to Europe. Obviously, these were not the only items traded on these routes, and this was not the only triangle trade route. Triangular trade is just a historical term that indicates trade between three ports or regions. Triangular trade usually evolved from regions having goods to export that aren't required in the region from which the main imports come from. So triangular trade thus provided a method for fixing trade imbalances between three particular regions. Why? Why trade slaves? Why trade people? Well, as we learned from colonialism, Britain had acquired a lot of territory and a lot of land with rich soil and good weather, which made it perfect for agriculture. At the time, there was a lot of money to be made from sugar, cotton and tobacco, so many colonies in America and in the West Indies became plantation colonies. The sugarcane grown was used not just as simple sweetener in foods and drinks, but also for the production of rum, whiskey and other spirits. The cotton was used for textiles and the tobacco was grown to produce cigars, cigarettes or even chewing tobacco. Growing crops in large quantities to trade meant a lot of work, so labourers were needed. European traders saw that labourers were required and they decided to acquire them from West and Central Africa. Many were simply kidnapped by Europeans and some were sold to white Europeans by African traders. These people were then loaded onto ships and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. When they reached where they were going, they were sold. The harvested crops would then be loaded onto the ship and the ship would head to its next port to deliver those crops, and the cycle continued. Fact. London merchants shipped cheaply made glass beads to West Africa. The beads were highly valued in Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved Africans. A slave ship, as the name suggests, is a ship that carried slaves. Simple. Slave ships were slightly different from a normal cargo ship, though. They were altered to be able to fit as many slaves as possible. More slaves means more money. Slave ships carried hundreds of people, and for a ship to carry between 200 and 300 slaves wasn't uncommon. Slaves were naked and shackled together with chains, meaning conditions were hot and cramped to the point that people could barely move. There was no fresh air. The enclosed space and close proximity gave rise to conditions of poor hygiene and sanitation. Many illnesses and diseases affected the slaves, but dysentery, which is a type of infection of the intestines that causes diarrhea, and dehydration and scurvy, which is a disease caused by the lack of vitamin C, all meant that many of the slaves died en route. Slaves were underfed and treated with such brutality that malnutrition and inflicted violence was another cause of death among slaves on the slave ship. So, what did they do with the bodies? Well, the dead and dying were thrown overboard into the ocean. However, this was not always instantaneous, and slaves often went days chained to dead bodies. This journey across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage because it was the time in between the capture of the slave and their sale. It took around 2 months to complete the journey, but many didn't make it. Olada Aquino was an African man who, as a child of 8 years old, was captured in what we now know today as Nigeria and taken into slavery. 8 years old. He was sold to a British naval officer in the Caribbean, and at the age of 21 he was able to buy his freedom. As a freed man, he went to London, where he supported the abolitionist movement to end slavery. He was part of the Sons of Africa, which was an abolitionist group made up of Africans living in Britain. He became well known after he wrote and published his autobiography, which depicted the horrors of slavery. During his lifetime, it went through 9 editions and was instrumental in getting laws passed that ended the slave trade. This is an extract from the memoir of Olada Aquino. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were almost daily brought upon deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries. Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and as often wished I could change my condition for theirs. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful, and heighten my apprehensions, and my opinion of the cruelty of the whites. Here we can see on the left the typical layout of a slave ship. You can see the bodies closely packed in together, and the 2 illustrations denote the stacking of the bodies. And then going over to the top right is a sketch of enslaved Africans being led down into the hold, and at the bottom right is an artist's impression of what it would have looked like, roughly, inside. Did you know some Londoners who were against the slave trade bought sugar from East India? They said it was better than West Indian sugar because it was not harvested by enslaved Africans. Slave auctions. Slave auctions were the place where people, predominantly white people, could go to purchase enslaved Africans. As you can see by the poster on the right, the auctions were advertised, and it also highlights the slaves being sold as being seen as commodities, and also just shows the dehumanising nature of the whole thing. Slaves were described by their ability to work, and would have been prepared beforehand to make them look healthy following the 2-month voyage they would have just endured. Potential buyers would have inspected them like animals before the auction started. The Great Slave Auction of 1859 was the largest single sale of enslaved Africans held in America. The auction was being held by a plantation owner named Pierce Butler to clear significant debts that he had built up from gambling. 436 people advertised for sale, of which 429 were actually sold. The majority of those sold were rice and cotton field workers. Others were skilled coopers, carpenters, shoemakers, blacksmiths, and cooks. The slaves who failed to sell were either ill or disabled. A family, so a mother and her 5 grown children, was sold for $6,180, and the highest price for an individual was $1,750, whereas the lowest price was around $250. In total, Pierce Butler made $303,850 over the 2-day auction. So we know from earlier when we looked at colonialism, hundreds of thousands of Africans and indigenous peoples, both free and enslaved, aided the establishment and survival of colonies in the Americas. Many colonies of which would never have been successful, let alone thrive, without their input. A significant starting point to slavery in what we now know today as the United States of America would be around 1619. In 1619, a privateer named the White Lion, so a privateer is an armed ship that is owned and crewed by private individuals that engage in warfare at sea, but they're sent by the government with the aim to capture merchant shipping vessels. In short, a privateer is kind of like a pirate, but a legal pirate, or a pirate with permission, let's say. So the White Lion was a ship that brought 20 African slaves ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Now, the crew of the White Lion had seized the Africans from a Portuguese slave ship, and this was a year before the Mayflower landed in Dorset. It's worth mentioning these 20 slaves were not the first slaves in America. As mentioned earlier, slavery existed within indigenous communities before the Europeans arrived. Even the Spanish and Portuguese had brought slaves to America before the British. However, throughout the 17th century, European settlers in North America turned to African slaves as a cheaper, more plentiful labour source. During the 17th and 18th centuries, enslaved Africans worked mainly on the tobacco and cotton plantations of the South, from the Chesapeake Bay colonies in Maryland and Virginia all the way south to Georgia and the Carolinas. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 meant that tobacco production was scaled back and cotton was the new power crop. Just to explain what the cotton gin is, it's a piece of machinery that quickly and easily separates cotton fibres from their seeds, enabling much greater productivity than manual cotton separation. The cotton gin revolutionized the cotton industry in the United States, but also led to the growth of slavery in the American South as the demand for cotton workers rapidly increased. Slavery itself was never as widespread in the North as it was in the South. However, many of the businessmen in the North profited and grew rich from the slave trade and investments in southern plantations. In fact, the wall that Wall Street in New York is named after was built by slaves, and before Wall Street was a financial center, it was a slave market. Anyway, the money southern plantation owners earned couldn't be kept under mattresses or behind loose floorboards, so American banks accepted their deposits and counted enslaved people as assets when assessing a person's wealth. JP Morgan, Lehman Brothers, and Chase, which is the biggest bank in America today, were all banks that accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans, and if plantation owners defaulted on loan payment, the banks took ownership of these slaves. Slavery was a key factor in the growth of the American economy. Enslaved people in the antebellum South. So antebellum refers to the time before the war. So enslaved people in the South before the American Civil War made up 1/3 of the entire Southern population. That shows how many enslaved African people were brought to the South, and most of them lived on large plantations or small farms, and many masters owned fewer than 50 enslaved people. Slave owners made sure their slaves were completely dependent on them and implemented very restrictive, let's say, quote-unquote, codes of conduct. They were usually forbidden from learning to read or write, and their behaviour and movement were severely restricted, usually limited to their work and where they lived. Female slaves did not have a say in how their bodies were treated and were often sexually assaulted and raped by their slave masters. Many female slaves fell pregnant with children fathered by their slave master, and those children were born into a life of slavery. Marriages between enslaved men and women were not recognized in law, but many slaves did marry and raise large families. Most slave owners actually encouraged this practice as it meant more labor, but nevertheless, slave owners very rarely hesitated to divide families by selling them on or removing them completely. Slaves who were compliant and obedient were often rewarded with favors by their masters. However, rebellious enslaved people were brutally punished, tortured, and sometimes killed, whether intentionally or as a result of the brutality. There was also a strict hierarchy amongst the enslaved, ranging from house workers to field hands. House workers and craftsmen and women were deemed to be privileged as they were permitted to work in the house, out of the crippling heat and excused of grueling manual labour. This system of hierarchy was strategic and helped keep the slaves divided. It often fostered bad blood between them, with accusations of preferential treatment, and made them less likely to revolt against their masters. The Maroons were a group of people established in Jamaica made up of Africans who had escaped slavery and established free communities in the mountains located inland. They date back to runaway slaves captured by the Spanish during the days of Christopher Columbus. When the British went to Jamaica in 1655 and imported slaves to work their sugarcane plantations, there were many slave revolts, and many slaves managed to escape, fleeing to the mountains, seeking refuge in the Maroon community. As mentioned in the last slide, there were many slave revolts throughout the Americas, from Massachusetts in the north of America all the way down to Guyana in South America. A slave rebellion or a slave revolt is an armed uprising by slaves, and slaves often rebelled against their captivity. They definitely fought back. A desire for freedom is natural, it's human nature. No human wants to be caged, physically or metaphorically. This sentiment fueled their acts of rebellion, and the dream of a successful rebellion was the subject of many slave songs and art among enslaved populations. There were quite literally hundreds of uprising, rebellions, and revolutions, and we can't possibly look at them all, but here are just a few before we move on to the most famous and successful. So the New York Slave Revolt happened in 1712. In the early 18th century, New York had one of the largest slave populations in any of the British colonies. Slavery in the city was a bit different from some of the other colonies because there were no large plantations. Slaves in the city worked as domestic servants, craftsmen, dock workers, and various skilled labourers. Slaves also lived near each other, which made it easier to communicate and formulate a plan compared to if they had been on a plantation. Events that presumably led to the revolt include a decrease in freedom and status when the English took over the colony from the Dutch in 1664. On the night of April the 6th, 1712, a group of more than 20 black slaves gathered and set fire to a building near Broadway. While the white colonists tried to put out the fire, the enslaved blacks, armed with guns, hatchets, and swords, attacked the whites, then ran off. Almost immediately, all the runaway slaves were reunited with their owners. Colonial forces arrested 70 blacks and jailed them. 6 were reported to have committed suicide. 27 were put on trial, 21 of whom were convicted and sentenced to death, including one woman with a child. The Stono Rebellion was a slave rebellion that took place in the colony of South Carolina on the 9th of September 1739. It was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies, with 25 colonists and 35 to 50 Africans killed. The uprising was led by native Africans who were likely from the Central African Kingdom of Congo, as some of the rebels spoke Portuguese. Their leader was a literate Congolese slave named Jemmy. In some reports, he is referred to as Cato, and likely was held by the Cato or Cater family, who lived north of the Stono River. Jemmy led 20 other enslaved Congolese, who may have been former soldiers, in an armed march south from the Stono River, which is how the rebellion got its name. Jemmy and his men were headed to Florida, where the Spanish had a colony in St. Augustine and had promised freedom and land to slaves who escaped the British colonies. Jemmy and his group recruited nearly 60 other slaves and killed some whites before being intercepted and defeated by the South Carolina militia near the Ediso River. A group of slaves escaped and travelled another 30 miles before battling a week later with the militia. Most of the captured slaves were executed. The surviving few were sold to markets in the West Indies. Following the rebellion, the South Carolina legislature passed the Negro Act of 1740, which restricted the gathering of slaves, the education of slaves, and the movement of slaves. The Negro Act also enacted a 10-year prohibition against importing African slaves because they were considered more rebellious. Tacky's Rebellion, Jamaica, 1760. Tacky, the leader of the rebellion, was originally from the Fanti people in West Africa, and before being enslaved, he had been a chief in Fantiland, which is in the central region of present-day Ghana. Tacky, along with the Ashanti Queen Nanny, both planned to take over Jamaica from the British to be a separate black country, but for themselves, not as allies. Tacky himself, as a king in his village, had sold rivals of the Ashanti into slavery to the British, but ironically became a slave himself when a rival state defeated his army in battle and sold him off to the British. Early morning on the 7th of April 1760, Tacky and his followers began the revolt and easily took over 2 plantations, killing their masters. Motivated by their easy success, they made their way to the storeroom at Fort Haldane, where the munitions to defend the town of Port Maria were kept. After killing the storekeeper, Tacky and his men stole nearly 4 barrels of gunpowder and 40 firearms with shot, before marching on to overrun 2 more plantations. By dawn, hundreds of other slaves had joined Tacky and his followers. At Ballard's Valley, the rebels stopped to celebrate their success. It was at this point one slave slipped away and sounded the alarm. Obeah, which is like a Caribbean witch doctor, Obeah quickly circled around the camp blowing a powder that they claimed would protect the men from injury in battle, while proclaiming that Obeah could not be killed. The confidence level was high. The rebels thought they had this magic over them that meant they couldn't be defeated. Anyway, soon there was 70 to 80 mounted militia on their way, along with some Maroons, who were bound by treaty to suppress these kinds of rebellions. Once the militia heard of the Obeah boast of not being able to be killed, the Obeah was captured, killed, and hung in a prominent place with his mask, which was made of teeth, bones, and feathers, visible from the encampment of rebels. This shook the confidence of most of the rebels, and they quickly returned to their plantations, but Tacky and 25 or so men decided to fight on. Tacky and his men went running through the woods, but Tacky was shot and decapitated. Tacky's head was mounted on a pole as a deterrent until one of his followers took it down in the middle of the night. The rest of Tacky's men were found in a cave near the waterfall that is now known as Tacky Falls. They had all committed suicide rather than going back into slavery. Gabriel's conspiracy took place in the summer of 1800. Gabriel was a literate enslaved blacksmith born into slavery on a tobacco plantation in Henrico County, Virginia. Gabriel had 2 brothers, Solomon and Martin, who were all owned by a man called Thomas Prosser. Thomas Prosser was the owner of the plantation where they had all been born. It's claimed white people as well as black people regarded Gabriel as a fellow of great courage and intellect above his rank in life. On the 30th of August, 1800, Gabriel intended to lead slaves into Richmond, but the rebellion was postponed because of rain. The slaves' owners had a suspicion of the uprising, and 2 slaves confessed to their owner about the plans. Virginia's governor, James Monroe, was warned and called out the state militia. Gabriel managed to escape downriver, but he was spotted there and betrayed by another slave for the reward offered by the state. That slave did not receive the full reward. Gabriel was then returned to Richmond for questioning, but he did not submit. Gabriel, his 2 brothers, and 23 other slaves were hanged for conspiracy. As a result, Virginia and other state legislatures passed restrictions on free blacks, as well as prohibiting the education, assembly, and hiring out of slaves to restrict their chances to learn and to plan similar rebellions. Sam Sharp was an enslaved Jamaican man who was the leader of a slave rebellion in Jamaica in 1832. Sam was born into slavery in the parish of St. James, Jamaica, on a plantation owned by Samuel and Jane Sharp around 1805. Around 1831, slaves learned that the British Parliament was discussing the abolition of slavery, and literate slaves followed the news closely. Sam Sharp mistakenly believed that emancipation had already been granted by the British Parliament, so on the 27th of December 1831 he organised a peaceful general strike across many estates in western Jamaica to protest working conditions. As this was harvest time for the sugarcane crop, it was a critical time for the plantation owners. Generally, around harvest time, the workforce had to work overtime to process the cane quickly at its peak. Reprisals for the plantation owners over the protest led to the rebels burning the crops. Sharp's originally peaceful protest turned into Jamaica's largest slave rebellion. The uprising lasted for 10 days and spread throughout the entire island, mobilizing as many as 60,000 of Jamaica's enslaved population. The colonial government used the armed Jamaican military forces and warriors from the towns of the Jamaican Maroons to stop the rebellion, and had suppressed it within 2 weeks. 14 whites were killed by armed slave battalions, but more than 200 slaves were killed by troops. Afterwards, more reprisals followed. In 1832, the government tried, convicted, and hanged many of the leaders, including Sharp. A total of 310 to 340 were executed through the judicial process, including many for minor offences such as theft of livestock. Before his death, Sam Sharp said, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live my life in slavery." The rebellion and the government's response provoked 2 detailed parliamentary inquiries. The Jamaican government's severe reprisals in the aftermath of the rebellion are believed to have contributed Parliament's passing of the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act that finally abolished slavery across the British Empire in 1838. Samuel Sharp was proclaimed a national hero of Jamaica in 1975, and his image is on the $50 Jamaican banknote. I'm going to warn you that this is going to be a bit long, but please bear with me. I'm going to tell you a bit about the Haitian Revolution, the most successful slave rebellion ever. It happened in Haiti on the island of Hispaniola in the year 1789. So at the time, Haiti was not only the most profitable colony in the French Empire, it was also the wealthiest colony in the whole of the Caribbean. In 1789, Saint-Domingue, which is what we now know as Haiti, it produced 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the sugar imported by France and Britain. The colony's white population numbered 40,000, mulattoes, who were mixed-race people, and free blacks made up 28,000, and black slaves made up an estimated 452,000. This was almost half the total slave population in the Caribbean, which in 1789 was estimated around 1 million. Enslaved blacks were regarded as the lowest class in colonial society, and they outnumbered whites and free people of colour by a margin of more than 6 to 1. 2/3 of the slaves were African-born, and they tended to be less submissive than those who were born in the Americas and raised in slave societies. The death rate in the Caribbean exceeded the birth rate, so imports of enslaved Africans was necessary to maintain the numbers required to work the plantations. Following the French Revolution, the French National Assembly published the Declaration of Rights of Man. This declared that all men were free and equal. The declaration was ambiguous as to whether this equality applied to women, slaves, or citizens of the colonies, and thus influenced the want for freedom and equality in Haiti. In 1791, the French revolutionary government moved to grant citizenship to wealthy free people of colour, but white plantation owners refused to comply with this decision, and within 2 months, isolated fighting broke out between the former slaves and the whites. On the 14th of August 1791, the slaves gathered to revolt. It started with thousands of slaves attending a secret voodoo ceremony as a tropical storm rolled in. Dutty Bookman, a voodoo priest and leader of the Maroons, gave the signal. Later that night, slaves began to kill their masters, actions which plunged the colony into a civil war. Within 10 days, slaves had taken control of the entire northern province. Years of oppression by the plantation owners had left many blacks with a hatred of all whites, and the revolt was marked by extreme violence from the very start, with many slaves seeking revenge on their masters through torture, rape, and death. Slave masters and mistresses were dragged from their beds and killed. In the southern province, 13,000 slaves and rebels burned plantations and freed other slaves. They then burned to the ground the two largest cities in the southern province. The plantation owners in Haiti had long feared this kind of revolt and had made defensive preparations, but within weeks the number of slaves who joined the revolt in the north reached 100,000, and within the next 2 months, as the violence escalated, the slaves killed 4,000 whites and burned or destroyed 180 sugar plantations. At least 900 coffee plantations were destroyed, and the total damage inflicted over the next 2 weeks amounted to 2 million francs, which is around 50 million euros in today's money. The surviving whites organised into militias and struck back, killing around 15,000 blacks. It's worth mentioning that at this point, the rebels were fighting for freedom from slavery. They weren't demanding independence from France. In fact, most of the rebel leaders claimed to be fighting for the King of France, who they believed had issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and this declaration had not been acknowledged by the colonial governor. So at this point, they saw themselves as Frenchmen demanding their rights that had been granted by the king. By 1792, slave rebels had gained control over a third of the island. The success of the revolt then caused the National Assembly in France to grant civil and political rights to free men of colour in the colonies, shocking countries throughout Europe as well as the United States. National Assembly was determined to stop the revolt. However, aside from granting the rights to free people of colour, the Assembly also dispatched 6,000 French soldiers to Haiti. A new governor was appointed by Paris and sent to Haiti. He abolished slavery in the northern province and had hostile relations with the plantation owners. Then in 1793, France declares war on Great Britain, and the Haitian whites, unhappy with the new governor, arranged with Great Britain to declare British sovereignty over the colony, believing that the British would re-establish slavery. At this point, the British thought the slave revolt might inspire similar events in the British colonies, and that taking Haiti, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the wealthiest of all of the Caribbean colonies, would be useful for negotiating later with France. But in the meantime, occupying Haiti would divert a great deal of wealth into the British treasury. The irony was it ended up being a bit of a shambles and ended up costing the British treasury millions of pounds and the British military thousands of dead, all for nothing. At this point, Spain controlled the rest of the island of Hispaniola, which we now know today as Dominican Republic. And when Spanish forces invaded Haiti, they were joined by rebels. For most of the conflict, the British and the Spanish supplied the rebels with food, ammunition, weapons, medicine, naval support, and military advisors. Now, a man by the name of Toussaint Louverture was a self-educated former domestic slave. Initially, he fought for the Spanish crown, but after the British invaded, he decided to fight for the French if they would agree to free all slaves. Louverture abandoned the Spanish army in the east and brought his forces over to the French side on the 6th of May 1794, after the Spanish refused to take steps to end slavery. Under the military leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the forces, made up mostly of former slaves, succeeded in winning concessions from the British and expelling the Spanish forces. In the end, Toussaint essentially restored control of Haiti to France. He was very intelligent, organised and articulate, and did not want to surrender too much power to France, and he began to rule the country as an effectively autonomous entity. To prevent military disaster and secure the colony for Republican France as opposed to Britain, Spain, and the French royalists, either separately or in a combination, the French commissioners freed the slaves in Haiti, and they made their declaration of abolition on the 29th of August 1793. Abolished slavery by law in France and all its colonies, and granted civil and political rights to all black men in the colonies. The French constitutions of 1793 and 1795 both included the abolition of slavery. In nationalistic terms, the abolition of slavery also served as a moral triumph of France over England. However, the story doesn't end there. Britain sent 30,000 troops in what was known as the Great Push to try and gain control over Haiti. The fleet for the Great Push left Portsmouth on the 16th of November 1795, but it was wrecked by a storm. Then 3 weeks later, more ships were sent. When they arrived, many British soldiers were weakened by yellow fever and ended up dying. And back in Britain, the government were being criticised for the mounting costs incurred by sending forces to Haiti. Then, in July of 1798, Britain withdrew completely from Haiti. In 1801, Toussaint Louverture issued a constitution for Saint-Domingue. This constitution decreed that he would be governor for life and called for black autonomy and a sovereign black state. In response, Napoleon sent forces from France with instructions to reinstate slavery and that Toussaint be arrested. In the April of 1802, Toussaint was captured and he later died in prison. For a few months, the island was quiet under Napoleonic rule. However, when it became apparent the French wanted to reinstate slavery, the blacks began to revolt again. The yellow fever that had killed many British soldiers was now doing the same to the French. The French were weakened, and a man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines led rebels into what would be the first ever group of enslaved people to successfully create an independent state through a slave revolt. On the 1st of January 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines became the new leader and declared Haiti a free republic in the name of the Haitian people. Unfortunately, slave rebellions did little in the way of convincing supporters of slavery to abolish it. In fact, supporters of slavery used these uprisings as an argument that black people were inherently inferior savages, requiring an institution such as slavery to discipline them. Fears of similar rebellions led many colonies and southern states of America to further strengthen their slave codes in order to limit the education, movement, and the assembly of enslaved people. The abolitionist movement was a movement in the 18th and 19th century that fought to end slavery and the slave trade. Abolitionists wanted to put an end to the buying and selling of slaves, and in 1807, trading in slaves, so the purchase or sale of another human being, was made illegal throughout the British Empire. However, the ownership of slaves was still perfectly legal until 1834. You just couldn't buy them. There was huge opposition to the abolition of slavery, none more than the London Society of West India Planters and Merchants, which was an organisation established in London to represent the views of the British West Indian plantation owners and slave traders. In 1700, Lord Chief Justice Sir John Holt said that as soon as a man sets foot on English ground, he is free. And following the case of Somerset v. Stewart in 1772, it was recognised that no legislation had ever been passed to establish slavery in England. The judgment of the Somerset case was generally taken at the time to have determined that slavery did not exist under English common law and was thus prohibited in England. As a result, by 1774, between 10,000 and 15,000 slaves gained freedom in England. However, the decision did not apply to British overseas territories or colonies. For example, the American colonies had established slavery in their own laws. In 1783, an anti-slavery movement began in Britain. That year, a group of Quakers founded their first abolitionist organisation, and the Quakers continued to be influential throughout the lifetime of the movement, in many ways leading the campaign. After the formation of the Committee for the Abolition of Slave Trade in 1787, William Wilberforce led the fight for abolition through parliamentary campaign. Slave trade in the British Empire was finally abolished with the Slave Trade Act of 1807. Wilberforce continued to campaign for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, which happened with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. From 1834, slaves became indentured apprentices to their former owners until emancipation was achieved, meaning enslaved people were bound to a master or mistress for 6 or more years, which for the majority meant by 1840 and for remaining exceptions by 1843. Full emancipation for all slaves was legally granted on the 1st of August 1838. The government set aside $20 million for compensation to slave owners for their loss of property across the empire, but did not offer the former slaves compensation or reparations. Up until 2015, the loan borrowed to repay the slave owners for their loss was still being paid for by British taxpayers. So for context, the descendants of slaves have been paying for the compensation of the people that enslaved their ancestors. The abolitionist movement in America is a little bit more complex than it was in Britain. In 1775, there was a war. This was the American Revolution and was a colonial revolt in which America separated from Great Britain and established itself as the United States of America. Up until that point, American colonials had been paying tax to Britain but had no representation in British Parliament. So on the 4th of July 1776, the United States declared independence from Britain. It was after the American Revolution that Americans in the North started to compare the oppression of enslaved Africans to the oppression they faced from the British. In 1789, the US Constitution came into effect. If you don't know what the US Constitution is, it's a document that established America's national government and fundamental laws while guaranteeing certain basic rights for its citizens. The Constitution acknowledged the institution of slavery, counting each enslaved individual as 3/5 of a person, so not even a whole person, for the purposes of taxation and representation in Congress, and guaranteeing the right to repossess any person held of service or labour, which is an obvious euphemism for slavery. The fact that an enslaved person was not considered a whole person shows how the lawmakers and those in authority viewed enslaved Africans. They were considered less than a person. The first abolitionist campaign in America took place from around 1830 to 1870, and in a lot of ways it used similar tactics that the abolitionist movement in Britain had used to end slavery in the 1830s. And the increased repression of black people in the South only fanned the flames of a growing abolitionist movement in the North. From the late 1830s, the movement began to gather momentum and was being led by free blacks such as Frederick Douglass, a former slave, and white allies such as the author Harriet Beecher, who you might know as the author of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The abolitionists saw slavery as an affliction of the United States, thus making it their goal to eradicate slave ownership. They sent petitions to Congress, ran for political office, and inundated people of the South with anti-slavery literature. While many abolitionists based their activism on the belief that slaveholding was a sin, others were more inclined to the non-religious free labor argument, which held that slaveholding was regressive, inefficient, and made little economic sense. Fact: one of the first martyrs to the cause of American patriotism was Crispus Attucks, a former slave who was killed by British soldiers during the Boston Massacre of 1770. Some 5,000 black soldiers and sailors fought on the American side during the Revolutionary War. Free black people and other anti-slavery Northerners began helping enslaved people in the South escape from their plantations to freedom in the North. This was known as the Underground Railroad and gained real momentum in the 1830s when conductors like Harriet Tubman guided escapees to a loose network of safe houses. No records or registers were kept, so it's impossible to put an exact figure on how many people were helped by the Underground Railroad, and estimates vary widely, but it's thought to have helped anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 slaves reach freedom. The Underground Railroad was undoubtedly a success, and its success only helped spread abolitionist feelings in the North. It also undoubtedly increased sectional tensions and convinced pro-slavery Southerners of their Northern countrymen's determination to get rid of an institution that they believed sustained them. The Star-Spangled Banner is the American national anthem, and the tune sounds a little something like this. Okay, so what you just heard there is a US Air Force band instrumental, but there are lyrics, and its lyrics come from a poem by a man named Francis Scott Key. The poem is called The Defense of Fort McHenry, and it was written in September 1814 after Key witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry by British ships of the Royal Navy. The first stanza goes something like this. And don't worry, I'll spare you my singing, but I'll just read it to you. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Now, Key himself was a lawyer from the South and was a slave owner, leading abolitionists to mock his words, claiming that America was more like the land of the free and the home of the oppressed. The third stanza actually references slaves, and throughout the last century and in recent years has been the cause of silent protest from the sporting community. The third stanza says, "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion at home and the country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out of their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave." During the 1830s, Key finally freed his slaves, keeping on only his foremen, whom he paid. From then, Key publicly criticised slavery and gave free legal representation to some slaves seeking freedom. However, he also represented owners of runaway slaves, and while he was district attorney, he actively suppressed abolitionists and did not support an immediate end to slavery. Key went on to be a leader in the American Colonization Society, which was founded in 1816. The society proposed the idea of freeing slaves and sending them back to Africa, a solution that thought to be a compromise between anti-slavery activists and slavery supporters. Key's brother-in-law and long-standing close personal and professional friend was a man named Roger Taney, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Roger Taney had given the decision in the Dred Scott case, which denied even the possibility of citizenship to African Americans and stated that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. I'm going to quickly tell you about the Dred Scott case because it's quite significant. Dred Scott was a slave who lived in a free state and territory, so he lived in an area where slavery was not allowed. Dred was owned by a man named John Emerson of Missouri. Emerson was in the military and moved often for his work, and Dred had moved with him from Missouri, a slave state, to Illinois, a free state, and finally into the Wisconsin Territory, a free territory. While in Wisconsin, Dred met and married Harriet Robinson, who became part of the Emerson household. Emerson himself married in 1838, and in the early 1840s, he and his wife returned with Dred and Harriet to Missouri, where Emerson died in 1843. After Emerson died, Dred and Harriet attempted to purchase their freedom from Emerson's widow, who refused. In 1846, with the help of anti-slavery lawyers, Harriet and Dred Scott filed individual lawsuits for their freedom in Missouri State Court on the grounds that their residence in a free state and a free territory had freed them from the bonds of slavery. It was later agreed that only Dred's case would move forward. The decision in that case would apply to Harriet's case as well. The Scott versus Emerson case took years to be resolved. In 1850, the state court declared Dred Scott free, but the verdict was reversed in 1852 by the Missouri Supreme Court. Up until then, Missouri had a long-standing doctrine of once free, always free, and the reversal of the judgment invalidated that claim. Emerson's widow left Missouri and gave control of her late husband's estate to his brother, John Sanford, who was a resident of New York in the North. And because Sanford was not resident of Missouri, Scott's lawyers filed a suit against him in a US District Court, which found in Sanford's favour. The case eventually reached the US Supreme Court, with Chief Justice Roger Taney presiding. In his opinion, he ignored precedent, distorted history, imposed a rigid rather than a flexible interpretation of the Constitution. He ignored specific grants of power in the Constitution and dragged meanings out of other more obscure clauses. His logic on the citizenship issue was perhaps the most convoluted. He admitted that African Americans could in fact be citizens of a particular state, and that they might even be able to vote, as they did in fact in some states. But then he argued that state citizenship had nothing to do with national citizenship, and that African Americans could not sue in federal court because they could not be citizens of the United States. Dredd's case, therefore, should have been dismissed for lack of jurisdiction by the district court. Taney stood on shaky constitutional ground in this particular point because if even one state considered an African American a citizen, then the Constitution required that all states, and by inference also the federal government, had to accord that person all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Article 4, Section 2. And that includes the right to sue in federal court. Anyway, it goes on, and you can look it up for yourselves if you wish to. But in short, the case's decision was that Dredd was not entitled to his freedom, that African Americans were not and could never be citizens of the United States, and that the Missouri Compromise, which happened in 1820, which had declared free all territories west of Missouri and north of the Mason-Dixie line, was unconstitutional. The decision added fuel to the sectional controversy and pushed the country closer to civil war. The American Civil War was a civil war that was fought in the United States from 1861 to 1865 between northern states loyal to the Union and southern states that had seceded or left the Union to form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began primarily as a result of the long-standing controversy between the North and South over the enslavement of black people. In 1861, Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln was elected as president, and within 3 months, 7 southern states had seceded to form the Confederate States of America. Those states were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Then after the war began, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Virginia also joined. On the 22nd of September 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation stating that if the rebels did not end the fighting and rejoin the Union by the 1st of January 1863, all slaves in the rebellious states would be free. Lincoln wasn't playing around, and on the 1st of January 1863 he made it official that slaves within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. By freeing the 3 million or more enslaved people in the rebel states, the Emancipation Proclamation deprived the Confederacy of the bulk of its labour forces and made the Unionists favoured in the eyes of the public at an international level. Around 186,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army, with about 38,000 losing their lives. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't officially end all slavery in America. That would happen when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse on 9th of April 1865, ending the Civil War and slavery. However, it was not until 19th of June 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was read in Texas, that the last slaves were released. Top left, we have the Union Army fighting in blue, carrying the Stars and Stripes, and Confederates in grey, carrying the Confederate flag. Then moving top right, we have President Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg for the Gettysburg Address in 1863. Bottom left, we have a photo of a group of black Unionist soldiers, and bottom right, we have an artist's impression of the battle. So, slavery officially ended in 1865 when the 13th Amendment was added to the US Constitution. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery except for punishment for a crime, stating, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." However, freed black people's status in the post-war South remained precarious, and significant challenges awaited during the period following the war, which is known as the Reconstruction period. So what does it all mean? Well, it means that previously enslaved men and women received the rights of citizenship and the equal protection of the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, and the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. But these provisions of Constitution were often ignored or violated when it came to black people. It was difficult for black citizens to gain a foothold in the post-war economy thanks to restrictive black codes and regressive contractual arrangements such as sharecropping. Also, the inclusion of except for punishment as a crime provided a loophole, one that is exploited to this day. Have you ever wondered why the number of black individuals incarcerated in the USA is disproportionate to those of their white counterparts? When slavery was abolished, law enforcement often enacted the except for punishment as a crime clause, enabling police to arrest poor freed men and force them to work for the state under convict leasing. This translates to modern day with prison industrial complex, which is the attribution of the rapid expansion of the US inmate population to the political influence of private prison companies and businesses that supply goods and services to government prison agencies for profit. So, for example, corporations or construction companies that contract cheap prison labour. So it appears there's a link between the disproportionate mass incarcerations and the money being made by corporations from those incarcerations. I know this all sounds a bit complex, but in the simplest way, it's the 13th Amendment provided a legal loophole which provided a condition on when you could still legally keep a black person as a slave, and that condition was as punishment for a crime. So, what have we learned about slavery? Let's recap. We've learned that Western Central Africans were captured on behalf of white slave traders and shipped in horrific conditions to the Americas, and this was known as the transatlantic slave trade, which was part of the wider triangle trade between geographic regions. We've learned that when slaves reached their destination, they were referred to as Negroes, they were given new white names, and they were sold at auction. We've learned that enslaved peoples had little to no rights and worked in forced unpaid labour. They were often brutalised by their masters and they were prohibited from learning to read or write. We learned about uprisings and rebellions. We learned that slaves often tried to revolt and sometimes they were actually successful. However, pro-slavery campaigners used this to support their argument for keeping blacks enslaved. We learned that the American South felt so strongly about keeping black people enslaved that they went to war with the North. We learned that although slavery was abolished, indentured apprentices in the British colonies and the 13th Amendment in the USA acted in some way as a get-out clause. We learned that slaves and their descendants have never received compensation or reparations of any kind. However, the slave owners were fully compensated. We've learned that many descendants of slaves still carry the surnames of the person who once owned their ancestors. We also learned that America's national anthem, which is still sung today in schools, before sporting events and at political rallies, was written by a slave owner. Okay, let's move on.